Imagine being in the woods by yourself and coming across a UFO. What would you do? Well, that's what happened to Stefan Michalak in 1967 and has now become Canada's most intriguing UFO case. Canada even made a collector's edition glow-in-the-dark silver coin to honor this mysterious event. So if you like mysteries, then you're in the right spot because this is a good one. This is the story of the Falcon Lake Incident. Stefan Michalak was an industrial mechanic by trade and an amateur geologist who liked to venture into the wilderness around Falcon Lake to prospect for quartz and silver, which was about 150 miles east of Winnipeg. Stefan had staked some claims the prior year, and he set off on the May long weekend to go and explore some more. On May 20th, 1967, Stefan was near this vein of quartz along the Canadian Shield when the 51-year-old was suddenly startled by this gaggle of geese, and when he looked up, he noticed these two cigar-shaped objects with this reddish glow that was hovering around 45 meters away. One of the crafts descended, according to Stefan's account, and landed on a flat section of rock and actually took on more of a disc-like shape as it landed, while the other craft stayed in the air for a few more minutes before it flew off. And believing it to be a secret US military experimental craft, Stefan then decided to sit down and actually sketched it out on his notepad over the next half an hour. He then decided to approach the craft and later recalled the feeling of warm air and the smell of sulfur as he started to get closer, as well as the whirling sound of motors and hissing sound of air. Light poured out of the upper circle of this craft, flooding the area with this purple and red light. It was so bright that it outshined the midday sun, and when Stefan looked away, his vision was obscured with these bright spots. Even though he was allegedly wearing protective goggles at the time that he was still wearing from prospecting. He decided to move a little bit closer, and within 60 feet, he listened, and there were supposedly voices. He held his breath and strained to hear what they were saying. From inside the craft, he heard two distinct voices, one higher pitched than the other, and they sounded human enough, although too muffled to make out what they were really saying. So Stefan then shouted out, "Okay, Yankee boys, having trouble!" thinking that it was the US military, and then shouted, "Come on out, and we'll see what we could do about it," which is obviously a very Canadian thing to say. But anyways, Falcon Lake is very close to the American border, and these were the Cold War days where there were all kinds of secret military things going on, supposedly. There was no reply from his craft, so he took a few steps closer. He said he hesitated a little bit, but walked right up to the small hatch and peered into the opening. And he stated that there were lights everywhere inside, with these focused lights shining across the interior, and a series of flashing lights turning on and off in seemingly random sequences. There was no signs of welding or seams to be found anywhere. It was extraordinary. So Stefan reached out with his gloved hand and touched the side of the craft, and it was supposedly very hot, like burning hot, so he removed his glove and noticed that it had melted. And without warning, the entire craft tilted slightly, which is interesting because that's how the gimbal UFO that the Pentagon released was maneuvering. Stefan then felt a scorching pain across his chest because at that point, his shirt had burst into flames, so he instinctively turned away and ripped this shirt off of his chest. He then felt a sudden rush of air around him, and when he looked back at the craft, he noticed that it had already risen above the treetops, and a split second later, it was gone. Stefan then started to feel nauseous, his head started to ache, he started to break out into a sweat, and started vomiting onto the rocks. He covered himself with a light jacket that he had, and started to make his way through the bush and towards the town. But at this point, he knew that there was something wrong with him. He eventually made his way back to his hotel room in Falcon Lake, and then caught a bus back to Winnipeg. He was treated at the Winnipeg hospital for the burns on his chest and his stomach that later turned into raised sores on a grid-like pattern, and for weeks afterwards, he suffered from diarrhea, headaches, blackouts, and weight loss. Still sick a year later, with reoccurrences of the burn showing up on his chest, and still suffering from blackouts, Stefan decided to go to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Doctors did a thorough investigation and even sent him to a psychiatrist who came back with a report stating Stefan as being a pragmatic person, very down to earth, and not the type of person to make up stories. This whole thing is almost hard to believe, but according to the archived documents of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, this went from a case of too many wobbly pops to a full-blown UFO hunt by the police, the army, and the Air Force. Items were later retrieved from this encounter site, which included Stefan's gloves, his shirt, and some of his tools, which were all subjected to extensive analysis at the RCMP crime lab, but no one could determine what caused these burns. At the landing site was a circle about 15 feet in diameter, where the moss and the vegetation seemed to be burnt or dead. Soil samples, along with samples of his clothing, were tested and deemed to be highly radioactive. So were pieces of metal that were chipped out of the cracks of this rock face a year after this incident. Somehow this metal had melted into the cracks of this rock. The Department of National Defense summarized this event kind of without a satisfying conclusion, stating that both the D&D and the RCMP's investigation teams weren't able to provide any evidence to disprove Stefan's story. So do you believe Stefan Michalak, or was this all just an elaborate hoax to possibly try and protect this land that he was prospecting? And let me know in the comments below. I would love to know your guys' opinion. So thanks for watching the video. If you did enjoy the vid, please give it a big old thumbs up for me, and consider subscribing to the channel for more weekly paranormal videos. I'll catch you next week. Thanks again, guys. Stay curious, friends.